I was asked to come along and speak about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed at the United Nations in New York in September, and how that applies to the problem of dealing with conflict. And in particular, what role the United Kingdom might play in following up on the SDGs, especially SDG 16, which refers to violence. Well, that's where I start being not very content. That's where I start saying it's absolutely not good enough. Well, it's good that it gets mentioned, but let's think about the United Nations. It was founded after the Second World War, just as the European project was started after the Second World War. And I'll come back to that. But it was founded, why? Because it was recognized that the League of Nations had been a failure, but that some kind of international place to talk, to discuss, to debate, and not to go to war was crucial for the human race. In fact, its very first principle is that the United Nations is there to address issues of conflict and war. And when we come to the SDGs, there are 17 of them. Number 17 is about implementation. The issue of conflict doesn't get addressed until number 16. If it had gone any further, it would have fallen off the table completely. And it doesn't talk about conflict resolution. It talks about dealing with all forms of violence and addressing issues of justice and good governance. All important things. But it doesn't seriously address what we need to do to deal with conflict. It's in there, so in a sense, those of us who are committed to this question have a sort of a foothold to say it's there and we want to deal with it. But frankly, it's not there in a serious way. Why is that? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. When I was in New York, I was talking to some of the people who were involved in putting it together, and it's absolutely clear that many, if not most, governments didn't want it on the list. And that even getting it in the way in which it was inserted was a struggle in itself. Many governments do not want to be held to account for the question of how they conduct conflict. And so they didn't want it there. But, you know, it's very easy to criticize politicians and the press and those who are in government. And they're the ones that have responsibility. And it's very easy to absolve ourselves and say, but of course, if we were in the situation, we'd do it completely differently and we'd solve the problems. But actually, I want to make an argument that many of the demands that have been made by those outside of government in the NGO community may have contributed to the problem. I don't want to ignore the fact that governments don't want to address it. But if you look at all the other SDGs, whether it's about poverty, or starvation, or illness and disease, or inadequate infrastructure, or the gender questions, all of these are important. All of them are positive. Not a single one of them can be successfully implemented in the context of conflict. None of them. Addressing conflict is an absolute prerequisite. Look at Syria. How could you address questions of poverty, clean water, inclusivity, gender, infrastructure? None of these things can be addressed in the context of Syria or Iraq or Palestine and Gaza or any of the other places where conflict is raging. And even in our own parts of the world, in my part of the United Kingdom, it was impossible to address these issues satisfactorily and adequately until it was possible to address the conflict. So why do I say that many of us in the wider NGO and civil society community may have contributed to the problem? I'll tell you why. Because by asking for all of these other things to be addressed, for saying we must address poverty, and we must address gender issues, and we must address climate change, and we must address water, and we must address all of these things, what happens? None of them get dealt with adequately. And the key prerequisite, the priority issue, gets relegated down the table and indeed off the table completely. That's what happens. That's the reality of humanity. The United Nations was established to deal with the question of conflict, to make sure that we did not go back to war. Has it been in any way successful? It certainly hasn't stopped us going back to war. In fact, it's getting worse. The European Union was a peace process. The European Union was not established for the purpose of developing a common currency, for the purpose of having an internal market, for the purpose of our leaders being able to be at the top table of global affairs. That was not the purpose of the European project. The purpose was to prevent another horrible war. The instruments were cooperation on coal and steel, cooperation on nuclear questions, cooperation on financial questions. All of these other things were the instruments. And what has happened? The instruments have become more important than the purpose. That's what's happened. A whole generation of young people have grown up not realizing just how horrible war is, just how awful conflict can be in our own part of the world. They've grown up with political rhetoric which says now that we've got the European Union, war is impossible to contemplate in Europe. This is nonsense. Nonsense. Dangerous nonsense. Why? Why do I say that? Because all of these issues are about relationships between people. Not particularly individual people, but between large groups of people. And there's a difference between relationships between individual people and large groups of people. And we don't actually understand large group psychology very well. But there are analogies. One of the reasons I went into psychiatry and psychoanalysis was to try to understand why individual people did things that were self-destructive. I don't just mean cutting themselves and harming themselves and taking overdoses and so on. But in lots of ways, in people's relationships, they do things that are not in their own best interests. And it seemed to me quite clear that that happens at community level. So the whole notion on which almost all of Western and indeed Eastern diplomacy has been based over the last 40, 50 or 100 years, the notion of rational actors operating on the best socio-economic power interests is nonsense. Because in almost all circumstances, we are not rational actors. And as existential threat begins to impinge on us, we become devoted actors. We are driven by passion, emotion, powerful feelings, which lead to us doing things that are not in our best interests at all. Knowingly going into circumstances, knowingly engaging in all sorts of behavior that leads to terrible damage to ourselves and to our relationships. And that became very clear to me in Northern Ireland. I was growing up in a part of the world which was not a wealthy part of the world. It was not a world which had perfect democracy. But growing up as a son of the manse, it was very clear to me that many people were coming to our home and telling us about places in the rest of the world where there was real poverty and terrible deprivation, and they didn't have an ongoing terrorist campaign like we had in Northern Ireland. So the idea that all of this was a result of a rational response to socioeconomic deprivation just didn't make sense. That was not the driver for us. So part of the business of going into understanding the psychology of individuals and large groups was to understand, well, then why do people do these things? And what became clear to me at home was that one of the great drivers was that not just one, but in a kind of sense, both sides of my community at home felt a sense of humiliation and disrespect. People in the nationalist community felt that historically they had not been given a fair crack of the whip, as we say at home. Not an entirely kind phrase, but you know what it means. It means that we've not been dealt with fairly, but also our culture, our beliefs, us as people, we've been disrespected, disregarded, set to the side. But actually, unionists felt the same. If you talk to unionist people, they will say there was no conscription here during the war, and yet we went in our thousands and tens of thousands and sacrificed ourselves for Britain, and Britain doesn't give a stuff. How more disrespectful can you be? So you had two sets of community, both of whom felt humiliated and disrespected. And until we find a way of being prepared to engage with people, not because we trusted them, you'd be daft to trust somebody who'd been trying to kill you. Trust is an outcome of a peace process, not a prerequisite for it. But you can start behaving in a respectful way, even with people for whom you do not have respect for what they have been doing. So if they come up and speak to you, you don't spit at them or turn your back. And gradually you begin to build up a positive relationship, not just with them, but with their community. And then you discover that there's something else, which is very toxic. The most toxic thing of all is the sense of humiliation and disrespect, but there's also something about unfairness. I use that word rather than injustice, because injustice has all sorts of legal connotations. But things can be unfair even when they're legal, and they can be fair even when they're illegal. Fairness is what my kids would have complained about when they were much younger. They didn't come and say, "Daddy, Peter has been unjust to me." They said, "Daddy, it's unfair." It comes from in here, not from up here. And people have that sense of unfairness in ways that you might not necessarily immediately imagine. Let me give you an example. So you've got a community of people that are poor, disadvantaged. Economy is not benefiting them because the economy is a disaster. And then you say, well, these people need education in order to be able to improve the economy. Absolutely. But when they're poor and uneducated, they very often say, well, we understand why we're poor. When you give people education, and they still have no opportunity of benefiting themselves, then they feel this is profoundly unfair. That's what happened in Northern Ireland. When Catholics were unable to get through to third-level education, they were able to make the argument to themselves, well, we're in a bad place, but if we improve our education, then we will be in a better place. And the Catholic community as a whole, working class, unemployed, right through to people in the middle classes, went for education, improved their situation, and by the time it came to the early to mid-1960s, a whole generation of young Catholics had got through to tertiary level education, and they said, it's not fair. We're as well educated. We're in as good a place as anybody else. So if you provide education, which is a good thing, but you don't provide the opportunity for people to benefit from their education, you actually create even greater frustration and anger than before the education was there. So you've got to be a bit thoughtful about how you do these things. Just as I said earlier on, it's all very well for us in the NGO and civil society community to be demanding that we deal with all of these other problems. But if we don't deal with them in a way that is sustainable, and it's always going to fall foul of violence and conflict, that's only going to produce frustration and disappointment. Look at the situation in Gaza. There's no point in going in and spending millions of euros, as the EU has done, in building shops and hospitals and educational facilities and so on, and knowing that the Israeli government is going to come in and blast them to pieces. Unless you deal with the problem of the conflict, you're not going to get a good outcome. So if the first thing was humiliation and the second thing was a sense of unfairness, the third thing is giving people the opportunity to actually make a difference without the use of violence. If you give people an opportunity to make a difference and help them to understand that they don't have to be violent to do it, then there's a new route. And that's absolutely critical. When we were dealing with people in the Republican and in the Loyalist community who came to the point of saying, not just that they wanted to use violence as a tactic, but as a deep sense of anger and frustration they would engage in the violence, then you need to be able to say to people, there is another way. When I started to try to apply these understandings from home to places like the Middle East, and I went to meet with people who were leading figures in Hamas and Hezbollah and Jewish settlers and so on, I remember talking to them, and we asked the same kind of questions that we explored at home. Are you so committed to the use of violence that itself is almost a sacred value? Or if there was some way of dealing with your problems outside the use of violence, would you be interested in even exploring it? I remember very well the response from one of the leading figures in Hamas to me. He said, do you think we're mad? Do you think we want to live like this? We're doing this because we don't see any other way of addressing the problem. So I said, if there was any other possibility, if there's another possibility, let's talk about it. But we don't believe some of these people are prepared to talk with us. So you've got to try to provide a route out. If you trap people in, the frustration only gets worse and worse, and you end up with worse explosions. And that's what we're seeing all over the place. Well, as you could probably imagine, I'm passionate enough about all of this that I could go on about it for a very long time. And being the son of a preacher in a cathedral, my goodness, I could go on for a long time in an atmosphere like this. But I hope I'm saying enough to help you to understand that much of the problem we're dealing with is not something that's about beliefs and logical argument and rational engagement. It's about accepting the fact that all of us have a rational element to us, but it increases and decreases. And when we're under existential threat, and when our community is under existential threat, then that rational part disappears away down. Most of you won't remember what happened when you used to switch an old television off. Right? It used to go down into a little white dot in the center. You know, it doesn't happen anymore, right? The people who are laughing and remember it also remember the little blue bags of salt and potato crisp bags, let me tell you. These are real definitions of age. Look at the color of my beard. When I started off in a peace process, my beard was black, for goodness sake. But that logicality disappears down into a little dot when you get into a situation of violent conflict where you believe that you and your people are in real danger. The things that are important to you, not just for your life, but for your whole community. The existence of your culture, by which I don't mean just the art and so on. I mean your way of being in the world. When you feel that's under threat, then you're prepared to put your own life and your own interests and even the interests and well-being of your family to the side in order to express the anger, fury, hate that you feel. So how do we try to deal with these things? The first thing we need to do is reflect on them. You would be astonished how little time is available to political leaders to think, to reflect about anything. There's a 24-hour news cycle. There's an absolute demand that immediately something happens, if not beforehand, you respond before you've thought about it. All the time. You don't have the liberty to sit down and think and explore. Secondly, you have demands from your people that you do something. And people can see what's happening all over the world, and every time you open your mouth, it has to be to respond to the question, and what are you going to do about this, Mr. Prime Minister? What are you going to do about this, Mr. President? And if you say, I don't know at the moment, I need to give time to think about it, the immediate assumption is he doesn't care, he's not interested, his mind's on something else. And if you don't reflect, you make disastrous mistakes, as Chancellor Merkel has found. Here's a woman who clearly has a heart for people. She's very concerned about this huge number of people that are coming. She knows they're coming from very difficult circumstances. And she makes an intervention which is based on her sense of feeling for these people. And the result of it is effectively to say to people out there, more of you can come and we'll deal with it. And she can't deal with it. She can't deal with it for a whole bunch of reasons, not least because the speed with which things are changing affects the politics of your country. And if you can't bring your people with you, you're in trouble in a democracy. So we'll be very, very careful about when you speak about democracy, because you're not speaking about the mere rational casting of a vote. Almost no votes are cast on a rational basis. They're cast on the basis of what people feel, and what people feel today is completely different from what they feel in 2 weeks' time. So whenever she said that, I said to my wife, they say that now, they say what a great person she is now, but I tell you in 2 months' time, they'll be thinking about getting rid of her. That's the reality of the human condition. These are very challenging things. We need to take time to reflect on them in circumstances like this. That is why something like this place is so important. It's an encouragement in the very architecture of the place to stop, to reflect, to think, to appreciate the difficulties. Let me finish with 2 or 3 comments about that reflection, because reflection on its own doesn't make for the change. You have to accept that some of the things you believe will have to change. You see, this is coming out of a university. And in university life, what we do is we put forward certain ideas and then we test them out and we see, do they stand up to scrutiny, to the evidence? And sometimes they do. And sometimes they do partially, and sometimes they don't at all. Sometimes you get the exact opposite result from the one that you expected. But that's not how you go into politics. You don't stand for election saying, I have really no idea about anything at all, but I'm going to try out a few things, and they might work or they might not work. You don't get elected in that. You go into politics saying, I know how to solve these problems. We used to say about young doctors, you know, they start off and they make a diagnosis in the first 2 minutes and they spend the next 25 years trying to prove they were right. Because that's what it's like for us. Our whole selves become invested in the beliefs that we've got. That's what it's like when you get involved in politics. It's like when you get involved in church life or in charitable life or civil society or NGOs. You come with a set of beliefs. But the value of being involved with university life is you then submit those to scrutiny. And you begin to discover that some of the things that you hold dear may not actually stand up to scrutiny. It may not be the way things work out. And then you try to find out why. You don't simply accept it and say, okay, I'll believe something different. You say, okay, let's try to understand it. An example of that is a piece of work that we did a little while ago with Palestinians. We went and we said to them, okay, you're not going to get right of return, but we're going to give you money. What's your reaction? Anger. We're not going to be able to give you right of return, but we'll give you a shed load of money. What's your reaction? Much greater anger. You won't get right of return, but the Israeli government will say, we now appreciate that what we have done has been very hurtful to Palestinian people. What's your reaction? That's the basis for a conversation. And we took this to the White House and to the National Security Council in Washington, D.C., and they said, that's impossible. What do you mean it's impossible? It can't be that you offer people more money that you get a more negative response. He said, well, actually it is. And if you don't understand something as fundamental as that, it's no wonder what you're doing is only making things worse. Not because you're bad people, not because you're nasty people, but because you don't get what it feels like to be a person in those circumstances. I know exactly what it feels like. You know, when Harold Wilson described loyalists in Northern Ireland as spongers, because he said the only thing they were interested in was staying in the UK for the money, they all came out with sponges applied to their lapels as a rebellious indication of what they thought of his understanding of politics and life in Ireland. People get very angry when you don't understand that there are some things more valuable to them than even socioeconomic benefit. So we need to be prepared to challenge our own beliefs. We need to be prepared to change our attitudes. We all grow up with various different kinds of attitudes to a whole bunch of different people. And when we meet them, the history of our personal experience, of that of our community, makes us feel negatively about some and positively about others. And both of those may be misguided. Because ultimately, if we're going to find a way through these problems, we're going to have to compromise with our enemies. That's not a very easy thing to put in political terms. When you stand up politically, you've got to say, we're going to win. We're looking for victory. It's not very popular to talk about compromise, but it's the reality. I remember we were talking earlier on about Iraq, and I remember doing some work with the Iraqi political parties. We brought them all the way to Helsinki, a place outside Helsinki. We had a number of meetings there. They came back, we had some more meetings there. Actually, they had to fly through Russian airspace because Western airspace wouldn't allow us to get there. And we went back to Baghdad and they signed an agreement. All of the political parties signed up an agreement. And they signed up to it after a set of discussions which included myself and 2 or 3 other people, including Martin McGuinness, exploring things with them. Of course, Martin could say things that were much more believable than me. People looked at him and they said, well, he knows what he's talking about. He's been in trouble. He's caused trouble. So what does he say? He says, listen, what we discovered was this. You can keep on fighting for another 5 years or 10 years or 25 years. And all you'll end up is more dead and injured people. You've got a political problem. You need to find a way of sitting down and talking about that political problem. You can do it now, or you can do it later. You can do it now, or you can wait until it's impossible. But that's the problem that you've got. He said, that's what we discovered. Then he said something that a lot of people in this part of the world would find very difficult. He said it was an ethical or moral problem. Once I came to the conclusion with my colleagues that sending our young folk out to bomb and shoot was not going to bring a positive outcome, we weren't going to be beaten, But we weren't going to win. Once I knew that, I had a moral dilemma. How long would I keep sending people out fruitlessly to expend themselves? A lot of people would have a difficulty with somebody like Martin McGuinness talking in those kinds of terms, but that was the perspective he was coming from. He saw himself and his people as soldiers fighting for a historic community. What happened to that agreement in Iraq? The answer is quite simple. First of all, Maliki tried to throw us out before we were able to get it signed. We went to the Americans and told them about it. They said, that's very nice, thank you very much. We're going to continue to support Maliki. And all of us knew from that stage that it was a disaster, that he was a disaster, but he was our disaster as far as America was concerned. As was said previously and famously about Saddam Hussein, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. That's very dangerous, faulty thinking. We have to find ways of engaging with our enemies. There are times when you engage and there are other times when you don't. It's not a question of saying, okay, at a drop of a hat, let's all go off and talk to ISIS. There are times when you can talk and times when you don't. There's times to fish and there's times to cut bait. But somehow we have to find ways of engaging with each other, because all of this is about relationships, historic, disturbed relationships between large groups of people. What do we know about relationships? If I do something that hurts you, humiliates you, disrespects you, treats you unfairly, you'll find it difficult to forget or ever forgive that. And if I meet up with you in 40 years' time, the first thing that you will think about is that's the guy who humiliated me. And if that's true in decades of an individual's life, then it's true in hundreds of years of community lives. Hundreds of years. So when we get a peace settlement, there's no point in saying, okay, now let's draw a line under the past. We've sorted that problem. Because the feelings are still there. The memories are still impressing themselves on people and impacting on the way people feel and behave. And finding ways in which we can not just get ceasefires, have negotiations, deal with constitutional questions, institutional questions, human rights questions, policing and administration of justice, building an economic community, inclusivity in the community itself, everybody being able to play a role, all very important. We've done all those things at home. But you'll know that my colleagues are still negotiating at Stormont today. Why? Because the attitudes underneath, which are informed by the experience of hundreds of years, have not yet changed. And it's changing those attitudes that's fundamental. I go back to what I said at the start, and with this I'll finish. Once we forget the fundamentals and see the instruments as being the purpose of the exercise, the instruments of the European Union, the instruments of the United Nations. In a place like this, the institutions of a church, the building, the doctrine, the church government. Once we see those as the essentials, we've lost the plot. In a place like this, it's not the SDGs we want to see implemented, it's the Beatitudes of the fellow on the back wall. And once we forget those fundamental things and concentrate on the institutional things, the constitutional things, the instruments of delivery of the Beatitudes or the SDGs, we lose the plot. And our job is in ourselves and with other people to draw back to the fundamental purpose, which is how do we get better relationships between the groups of people of which we are a part. Well, that's for next year. Thank you very much.